presentation about Caribbean gold, and the Caribbean gold turns out to be sugar. So we'll see. This is, of course, my credentials, which you've seen before, and we'll skip this. And we're going to discuss the history and the growth of the sugar industry in the Caribbean, with some particular focus on the islands we're going to visit on this cruise, St. Bart's, Curacao, Aruba, and Dominican Republic. Now, as you might know, the very first sweeteners that humans discovered was honey. And honey, of course, comes from honeybees and the hives that they create. And those hives are generally found in trees or tree stumps. And in a sense, the discovery of honey meant a little bit of overindulging. However, you couldn't overindulge very long, because once you exhausted that hive, you had to go look for the next hive. And so it was not a regular part of the human diet at all in the beginning. There are two major alternatives to honey, of course, that were developed over history, and they are two sugar crops. They were the sugar cane and sugar beets. And they were introduced, very, very soon after. Sugar cane was the earliest discovery. Sugar beets came much, much later. And we're going to discuss both of those for the Caribbean, to say the least. Now, sugar cane is not native to the Caribbean. It was native to Polynesia, where it grew on most of the main islands there. But the plant had many, many uses. It was very effective because you could mix it with natural medicines, so to speak, the natives, indigenous had, to make them more palatable. And even today we can do that with our medicines. The cane was also something that they chewed. And it's interesting that it was a sweet treat, but the tough fiber in the cane actually would toughen their gums. So it was a very healthy piece, to say the least. And the leaves were used for thatching roofs, and the cane for inside wall coverings, and you'll see some of that. And at the end, the hollowed cane was used for making dart guns. And they used that as dart guns. They didn't have to create something. They just used the sugar cane itself. Now, sugar cane is a jointed reed, and it grows from 3 to 9 feet tall. It's cut, and if you cut it by leaving enough of the base, it will regrow. And so when cut properly, these plants can survive up to 8 to 10 years. Harvesting needs some skill to be able to know that, and a little strength. And it's also, of course, not frost-proof cane, so it can only be grown in warmer climates. And that's why Polynesia and ultimately the Caribbean were perfect for it. Now, this is a fairly complicated chart, so we'll see it twice. But sugarcane and sugar beets originated outside of the Caribbean. And as you can see, if you focus on the pink dots, that's sugarcane, and it's been around way longer than sugar beets. The first evidence of sugarcane growing was in New Guinea, as early as about 8,000 BCE, and there's possibly early as 10 to 12,000 BCE. And New Guinea is the furthest pink dot on the chart, just north of Indonesia, north of Australia, and New Zealand, of course, too. So anyway, from there, it spread, and it spread to Asia, India, Mesopotamia, and eventually it actually spread to the Iberian Peninsula of Spain and Portugal. Now, sugarcane was introduced to the rest of Europe during the 11th century, during the period of the Crusades. And very quickly it became imported to all countries all throughout Europe. Finally, 600 years after it reached Spain, sugarcane was brought over to the New World by Christopher Columbus. And so we have dates in the New World now of sugarcane being there. Now, the Portuguese, who were the main explorers at this period of time before Columbus, really, and after Columbus too, eventually took control of the worldwide sugar production, and that was in about the 15th century. It was an economic byproduct of their exploration and exploitation or colonization of the Atlantic islands that they had found, the Azores, Madeira, along the African coast. And it was a new kind of agriculture that was being invented to produce sugar. And that's the plantation system. We all know about plantations. Sugar was the thing that introduced the plantation system. And the first plantations were set up by the Portuguese when they conquered or when they discovered and settled in Madeira. And if you recall my first lecture on Bermuda, I talked about Bermuda and Madeira were the only two islands, 32nd parallel latitude, in the Atlantic Ocean. They were in the mid-Atlantic Ocean, not on the coastal shelves. And so they were volcanic islands, to say the least. Now, Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal, who is the individual that's famous for financing all the Portuguese expeditions in the early days, decided that sugar production held the key to success for his Atlantic acquisitions. And by 1460, this island, Madeira, was the world's largest sugar producer. And it maintained itself as the main, product of the island until the mid-16th century, when it was gradually replaced by wine. So we have the Madeira wine, which we still have today. Anyway, sugar beets. Sugar beets are the purple dots. They were introduced as a sugar-producing crop much later than sugar cane. And the sugar beet was grown in Europe as a garden vegetable, and it was used for fodder for the cattle, etc., long before it was valued for its sugar content. I don't know, I guess feeding it to the cows, no one had tasted it themselves. And so, but they realized, wait a minute, it's very sweet. They've got some real sugar in this thing. Now, looking at the purple dots for sugar production, you can trace, as you'll see, it can only be traced back as early as the 1800s in Germany. And according to historical records, sugar was produced experimentally from beets in sugar in 1747 by a local chemist. But the first sugar beet factory wasn't built until 1802 in what is now Poland. Finally, the crops were introduced into the Americas in the early 1800s and as far as California by the late 1800s. Now, this chart doesn't go back to the 1800s, but during, and I'll just mention one other incident, during Napoleon's reign in France, 40 sugar beet factories were established in France during his time. Now, beet sugar production increased rapidly throughout Europe, and by 1800, that tonnage had overtaken cane sugar as the main source of sugar. Beet sugar now accounts for almost all sugar production in the European Union and 1/5 of the total world production. Now let's take a look at sugar beets, because they're a little different from what you think you know about sugar beets. It's a root crop, and they flourish in cooler climates, not real cold, cooler climates when the soil is rich and the growing season is at least 5 months long. These are much larger than the beets you're going to see in the produce section of your grocery store, or the ones that you're probably growing in your backyard gardens. These beets weigh a whopping 3 to 5 pounds when harvested, and the sugar beet juice contains, a high level of sucrose. And as noted in the chart we just saw, it is second only to sugarcane as the major source as the world's supply of sugar. Now, beet sugar currently represents about 54% of U.S. produced sugar, slightly higher than sugarcane. And according to the American Sugar Beet Growers Association, there's no difference between cane sugar and beet sugar. And there probably shouldn't be. It's both sucrose, which we know. While obviously a very important sugar crop for most of this presentation, we will focus primarily on sugarcane because that's what was grown in the Caribbean. And we're going to see some of that as we travel around the Caribbean. 60 years after the plantation system was started in Madeira, in 1493, Columbus introduced sugarcane to the Caribbean islands. He was the one that brought it there. Beginning with Hispaniola, which is sort of Haiti and Dominican Republic, the main island. But the industry was very slow to take off in that island, surprisingly enough. When the Spanish settled Cuba, and the colonists discovered that sugarcane flourished in that island's climate, it laid the foundation for what would become the sugar empire in the middle of the 1600s. And so, the southern Caribbean, roughly around the middle of the 1650s, the planters on the island of Cuba and then eventually Barbados figured out a way to plant the cane. And they did it very symbolically, differently than, instead of digging a hole and planting the cane in the hole, what they did, they planted cuttings in trenches, and the crop took off after that. This new method of planting quickly spread, and Caribbean sugar production became a very viable and competitive commodity, to say the least. So, following the plantation system, as I mentioned, that had first been established in Madeira, colonists in the Caribbean planted large acreages of this single crop, sugarcane, which could be shipped long distances and sold at a great profit in Europe. Sugarcane was the first crop to be grown in this system, but many others followed, because we all know the plantation system had coffee, cotton, cocoa, tobacco, tea, rubber, and most recently oil palm. So, the plantation system took over how you grew most of the profitable crops of the day. To maximize the productivity and profitability of these plantations, slaves or indentured servants were imported to maintain and harvest this crop-intensive, sugar. So unfortunately, we know that slaves were brought into the Caribbean to work the sugarcane fields, and the slave trade grew exponentially at that time. At this sad time in history, slavery was fairly common, and I think I mentioned that the other day. Throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the other parts of the world, when any nation was conquered, those of the conquered who were not killed were often taken as slaves. Of course, that doesn't make it right. But at the time of the New World exploration and the exploitation, slavery was seen as a much more economic, cost-effective way to farm. And the reasons are basically up here for that. With slaves, they would survive 7 years or so, not very long, but they were a free source of labor, didn't have to pay them, they had an endless supply, and they were forced to do hard labor. Whereas indentured servants were only on a contract for 3 to 4 years, and at the end of the contract, you had to have a land grant for them. So that's the reason they came, so they could stay and they could be a landowner. And it was very limited immigration, and of course they totally resisted hard labor because they wanted to live. They didn't want to be killed by doing such hard labor. And so the primary source of slave labor was, of course, Africa. And this is the famous triangle trade that you've probably seen or studied when you studied European history. Europe to Africa they sent manufactured goods. Africa to Caribbean, they sent slaves. Caribbean to Europe and North America was sugar, and we're going to talk about rum. And North America to Europe was molasses and then rum. So that's the trade that was going on, and I didn't want to get too much involved in that because, you know, we obviously were able to get rid of it. And so British abolitionists actively opposed this transatlantic trade in African people since the 1770s. And several abolitionist petitions were organized in 1833, and they collectively collected about 1.3 million signatures at that time, which is a very large number for that time. These sentiments spread across the Atlantic to North America, and they took root there as well. And finally, unfortunately, the slave trade began to be recognized as inhumane, if you wish, and just wrong. And so beginning in the 1800s, the slave trade was abolished, first in Denmark, then in Great Britain, and then the United States. Slavery itself was finally abolished in the same country, in the same century, if you wish, by Great Britain, France, the United States as a result of the Civil War, and then Spanish Cuba, which was home of awful lot of sugar plantations, as I mentioned. So, how did sugar plantations survive? Well, they found ways to increase sugar production by the introduction of newer and more efficient machinery. Finally, technology plays a role. This is a drawing of how the crushing of cane became a much bigger operation with larger machinery. So you didn't need the labor to do that. And by the 18th century, in the Caribbean itself, machines were able to produce 80 to 90% of the sugar for Europe. And plantations, in a sense, became sugar production machines. So let's take just 1 second, even though I'm no expert on this, but this is how sugar was actually produced. They cut the cane and they would crush it within 24 hours to get the cane juice out of the cane. They boiled that to evaporate the excess water off, and you'd end up with crystallized sugar. And 20 pounds of cane would make 1 pound of sugar. So you needed a large plantation, to say the least, for that. And you know, this is a much more modern example of what we're doing today still with sugar cane, but that's in essence what they were doing. And this is what they produced. This is the sugar crystal on the picture on the left. It was molded into small capsules or these pellets like that. And these were easier to ship and to store. And on a trip to Canada last year, Lynn and I were able to visit a historic trading post. And they were able to show us some actual sugar pellets like this that had been arrived from the Caribbean over more than a century ago. On the right, we can see the forms of sugar that people are most familiar with: white, refined sugar, and unrefined brown sugar. Now, let's talk about two products that you get from sugar. Sugarcane, one sugarcane product is, of course, molasses. It's made simply by crushing the cane to extract the juices, boiling the juice down to a syrup consistency. And you get molasses, and that's very sweet, and it's a sweetener that we use a lot. And then there is rum. This is another sugarcane product. It's made from molasses, at least initially, and for centuries molasses has and continues to be the driving ingredient used during the fermentation of rum. There's a huge ongoing debate among historians on where rum originated. But the one thing is known for sure. When molasses is mixed with water and yeast, fermentation happens. And this fermentation creates a form of wine, which then can be distilled and turned into rum. And 1 acre of sugarcane would give you 200 gallons of rum. But an acre is really large, of course, but 200 gallons of rum. Now, very large barrels, which you can see here, called hogsheads, were used to ship rum, sugar, and molasses abroad, getting to Europe. This is a drawing of a hogshead being transferred from a small boat to a larger ship for the voyage over to Europe. The rum was stored in these oak casks and experienced various atmospheric conditions as it traveled from the sugar mills in the tropics and Caribbean to the storage facilities back in Europe, in England and the non-tropical England or Europe. When the casks were open in Europe, they noticed that the rum had darkened in color and its taste had become richer. And so they realized that the climate had a big impact on maturation. And today's rums are not so clear because it's not so clear cut. Light, unaged rums can have caramel coloring added to make it look darker. Or it can be aged not using oak casks, so there isn't any dark color transfer. Naturally, dark color rums can also have their color removed to make them light. And so the aging process is the key for flavor and quality, but the lesser aged rums are great for mixed drinks, tropical drinks. And so if you're ordering rum, it's really tough to know, but you could do some homework on it because you can go on Google and probably find out a lot more information about how that company's rum is produced. Now, in the 1700s and the 1800s, Caribbean sugar estates focused on making sugar first and foremost. Any additional income that they got was treated as an offset to estate expenses. So rum was an offset to estate expenses. Thus, the ups and downs of early rum making closely paralleled the sugar industry, if you wish. And the 1800s, unfortunately, were a tumultuous time for the Caribbean sugar industry. It was buffeted by serious financial headwinds that saw many estates, many sugarcane estates shuttered or consolidated. Rum making naturally suffered as well, but many saw increased rum production as an opportunity to help offset losses from the sale of sugar. And this is obviously a sugarcane factory. Now, let's take a look at sugar yesterday and today as it relates to the specific Caribbean islands that our ship is going to visit on this cruise. And while you can buy first we're going to be in St. Bart's, and while you can buy very pricey rum in St. Bart's, the reality is sugarcane has never been grown there. Sugarcane has never been processed into sugar nor molasses there. The rum that's available in St. Bart's is made elsewhere, mainly on Guadeloupe. And once it arrives in St. Bart's, the rum and the rest, it's bottled and labeled for sale, as I said, at a very high price. And you're going to see that. St. Bart's a fascinating place, great, expensive retail stores, etc. They really have a little, they have the philosophy similar to what we have in Palm Beach. There's a motto, why pay less when you can pay more? So be careful if you wish, because you could get rum in a lot of other places much cheaper, but you know it's a fun island to visit, to say the least. Curacao. Now, Curacao was much more involved. It was settled by Arawak people from the South American mainland, and it was first visited by Europeans in 1499. Columbus never made it there. It was settled by the Spanish, and then later the Dutch, who established it as a major center for the trade in their Dutch West India Company. Now, in spite of having scant rainfall in Curacao or little fertile soil, the island of Curacao did develop a major sugarcane plantation economy under Dutch colonial rule, beginning in the early 1800s, so it's a little later. It was established in 1899 in Curacao, a company called the United Sugar Trading Company. And that today is the only sugar factory on Curacao. Now this trading company operates across all of the ABC Islands. That means it's Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. Those are the three Dutch islands. And we're going to see two of them, Curacao and Aruba. Now, Curacao was home to as many as 100 plantations that grew sugarcane. They also grew aloe and indigo. Approximately half of those estates are still standing, and dozens have been, like this one, beautifully restored and renovated. Today, many of these mansions operate as museums, restaurants, or boutique hotels. And so, depending on what kind of excursion you're taking, you'll probably see some of these and make sure the tour guide mentions and talks about them. Because they were very successful in their day. Now, Aruba is not. It was a Dutch gem in the Lesser Antilles, and it boasts an active rum scene, as this bar indicates, but it was not, unlike its neighbors, Curacao and even Venezuela. Sugarcane cultivation was not part of Aruba's culture or landscape. However, rum production was, and it's flourished on a small scale there since the mid-20th century. Local distilleries import molasses, which is then distilled and aged in barrels to make rum. And so you will get a local rum production in Aruba when you're there. Now, on a much, much larger scale, our last island that we're going to visit, Dominican Republic. It's long been a major grower, a major producer, and an exporter of sugar. Approximately 60% of the refined sugar we use in the United States comes from the Dominican Republic, mainly under the name of Domino. And, you know, my mother always had Domino sugar in our house. And it was very successful, obviously. It's a very successful sugar brand. Now, the labor conditions on the Dominican Republic, however, were not good. But the U.S. had increased pressure to improve sugar worker conditions, and they are much better today. But, you know, you can know for a fact that Dominican Republic is really a major producer of sugar still. Now, Caribbean used to be a world hub for sugar production. And in the 1740s, Jamaica and Haiti were the world's foremost sugar-producing areas, and the Caribbean produced almost all of the sugar consumed in Western Europe. Cuba emerged as a powerhouse in the 1800s, and sugar remained a major part of the economy for that region up into the early 20th century. But declining access to America and European markets and the high costs of production led to an industry-wide decline. And today, there remains significant sugar production in Belize, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. But all the other Caribbean islands really don't make sugar at all anymore. And the region contributes less than 1% of the world's sugar production. And you can see the Dominican Republic, how successful they are in the Caribbean with sugar production. But you know, sugar now comes from so many other sources. In fact, this chart, while just over half of all the sugar is produced in the Americas today, not just the Caribbean, a very large percentage is now produced in Asia. So, you know, it's competing with an awful lot of other areas, and the distance it has to go, you know, is a factor in the cost, to say the least. Now, despite the decline in the Caribbean's role, sugar consumption overall has continued to grow since the early days. And this is a chart that shows the average sugar consumption in Britain over the decades. And you can see in the 1960s, it was 110 pounds per person per year. So it's a lot of sugar. Sugar's used in so many recipes, and of course all the desserts have some kind of sugar in it. Another example is the U.S. This is ours up to the year 2000. We're very similar. Sugar consumption in the U.S. has also skyrocketed over the years. Now, it might have gone down a bit recently, in recent years, with the introduction of sugar substitutes like sucralose, which is Splenda, or stevia plant sweeteners, etc. But sugar still has a firm foothold in the worldwide diet, to say the least, because most recipes still have sugar instead of a sugar substitute, to say the least. Now, sugar revolutionized food processing and uses. We have it as a preservative in jams and jellies. We have it as a fermenting agent for alcoholic beverages. It's a sweetener, of course, it created the demand for coffee. It helped create that demand for coffee, tea, chocolate as an alternative to alcohol. So it really was very important. And the big advantages to sugar is that there is no change in the basic flavor of the food or drink. It sweetens it for sure, but there really isn't any change in the flavor of the drink or food. And so that's an important consideration for recipes and for all of us anyway. Now, it's very funny. Experts say that sugar is not a necessity and that it's addictive. Now, I would personally beg to differ on the necessity part. I mean, I think sugar is a vital necessity, at least the way my sweet tooth operates. And that type of ice cream is something I eat every day. We have ice cream in our freezer all the time. In fact, as Lynn will complain, I actually get ice cream for dessert at breakfast. So, but anyway, and we just experienced Halloween back in the States, and all the candies and sweets that were given out to everyone it's a tradition, and it's one that we were all raised on. My grandparents raised me on so much sweet that I can't get away from it. And it's very hard, but at least it doesn't have the same amount of calories as so many other additives, luckily. So anyway, sugar in the Caribbean, a powerhouse it was for years. And sugar cane was really vital for its success, still is in the Dominican Republic, but not now in St. Bart's, of course, or even Curacao. Even though it was important in Curaçao's history. And when you visit other Caribbean islands, you'll see the remnants, and people will take you to sugar factories or plantations. But you have to understand, sugar was the one that created the plantation system. So that's really an important change in agriculture, to say the least. So with that, I want to thank you. And my next lecture is going to be, again at 6 p.m. I apologize, I didn't set the time. Pirates of the Caribbean, because that's a exciting topic. And that's a copy of my book, which is in the my travel memoir, which is in the bookstore if you need it, or on Amazon. If you buy one in the boutique, I'll sign it for you. I'd be very pleased and happy to sign it for you. But that was an effort of mine on when COVID came. So, had to do something because we couldn't cruise and travel. So anyway, Pirates of the Caribbean next time. And I'm not going to wear a pirate outfit, but we'll be able to talk about it. So I thank you all very, very much for that.